Today, I'm going to talk about why sometimes we don't mourn because the shame that's involved. This is the Get Free Morning Show. I am your host, Sarah May. I wrote a book, The Complicated Heart. If you are in a tangled up or messy relationship, that's the book you want to go get. Grieving is the process of facing reality and letting go of our expectations. It's not just a death. We grieve the end of relationships. We grieve dreams. We do grieve deaths. We grieve there's a great many things, a great many losses that we have that are valid and worth grieving. When I was 8 years old, my grandfather, who I was really, really close with, oh my gosh, I loved him so much. My grandfather had died in a plane crash. And the way that I was told was, my stepmother came over to me and she just goes, "You know your grandfather's dead, right?" I was like, yeah. I just find out my grandfather, who I'm so close to, dies in this plane crash. And I don't know how to show anything because I was just told so flippantly, as though oh, it's just not a big deal. So that night, I end up just bawling my eyes out in my bed. And my stepmom knocks on the door and comes in and says, What are you doing? And I was like, "Nothing, I'm fine." And then she shut the door. It was my first experience with death, and it was my first experience with grief is something you do not do out loud. Grief is something you keep secret. For me, this is where I first learned that to grieve was shameful. So shame is that insidious thing that every single one of us experiences throughout our life that says something is wrong with me uniquely. I'm not good enough. This totally gets tangled up with our core lies, and obviously we are broken because of sin, but when we know Jesus, we are new and we are whole again. But shame continues to slither all around us, saying, no, something's uniquely wrong with you. And so you can't be vulnerable with people. One woman wrote to me and told me that she'd had a miscarriage. And when she would go to church, she wanted to somehow express to people that she wasn't okay. But she didn't know how to do that. And everyone's like, "Hey, how are you doing? What's going on? Are you okay now?" And it's like, "Yeah, I'm okay." Which wasn't true. And then, so many weeks go by and so many months go by and people just expect that you're fine now. Shouldn't you be over it by now? And so there's this shame when we're not over it, right? By a certain time period, when we're not over it, by when people think we should stop being sad over something. And that's not how grief works. Grief works in waves. And sometimes it's smooth and sometimes it just crashes you over and you don't know when or how that's going to happen. It's really important that we acknowledge the shame that is involved in grief, and so why sometimes we don't grieve. Instead of saying I should be over it by now, or it's not that big of a deal, or I'll just do it quietly and privately. You actually get to decide how you want to grieve, but just don't do it because of shame or somebody else putting that on you. If you choose to grieve silently and quietly, that's totally fine. So after my mom died, I was just grasping for how to grieve. I wasn't sure how to grieve because it had been a very, very confusing roller coaster with my mom. I Googled, how do the Jewish people grieve? How do people in the Bible grieve? What did they do? I found the Jewish tradition and read up on how they approach grief. So the biggest one that really helped to tether me in grief was the fact that they have specific time frames of grieving. So after the initial death of a person, you have 7 days. And that first 7 days, you do not go anywhere. You just stay in your home. You cancel all obligations and you don't do anything, go anywhere, see anyone. Unless you want to, but the reason for that is so that you don't have to have any pretense at all. You can cry when you want to cry. You can let your makeup drip down your face and you don't even have to care about it. the next period is like 30 days, and then the next is a year. And anyway, so they have these time periods. But that first 7 days for me was the most crucial because I wanted to grieve in a way that honored the process of grief and facing reality. And so I went home and I canceled every single obligation that I could cancel. And I decided to follow this. And I cannot tell you how helpful it was. It was hard for me to cancel things because I felt like, and this is what we do. I don't know if this is a Western culture thing. I don't know what this is, but we think like, no, I'm fine. I can handle it. Like I'm good. I'll still do what I need to do. And it's like missing the point. It's almost like how we choose to take a Sabbath rest every Sunday if we choose to do that. It's not like maybe we feel like we need it, but we're choosing it because it's healthy and good. And so to take that 7 days, I mean, it was so great because some days I would be fine, and then another day or in an afternoon, I would just be bawling my eyes out. And I didn't have to worry about being at a place, telling the story of my mom's death, like, oh, what's wrong? Are you okay? Like having to explain it, having to do all of these things. I could just let the waves hit when they were going to hit. And it's not only that it's only going to last 7 days. That's not true. It can last months, years, whatever. But this is a very specific 7 days that you choose to take. So if you have a miscarriage, or there is an ending of a relationship, or you get a horrible news, or you are mourning the loss of a parental relationship. I realized that my, father or my mother is not the person that they should have been to me. I think it's valid and okay to, if you can, to take those 7 days and allow the process of grief to happen and let it do what it's going to do. One of the things I did was I sat my kids down when I got home, and they didn't really know my mom, so they were not really grieving, but I sat them down and I, explained to them, like, my mother passed away, your grandmother, but again, they didn't really know her. But I did say, and you may feel sad, and it is okay to feel sad, and it's okay to cry, or to be angry, or whatever you need to do. I said, but you're going to see me cry sometimes, and I'm not going to hide it from you. And I said to them, what you need to know is that I'm okay. Like, I'm going to be okay. But this is part of grief. And so if you come home and you see me crying, you don't have to worry about me. You can know, okay, this is healthy and this is normal, and mom is grieving. Because there's this idea that we shouldn't grieve or cry in front of our kids. And I think we do a disservice when we hide grief, because then we don't teach them how to grieve, and it just perpetuates the shame cycle. I wanted them to know that grief was normal, grief can be seen, and you don't have to freak out or be worried if mom is sad or crying. And now there's a difference between laying like heavy burdens on little hearts not ready. Like, you're not going to go and like be bawling in front of your 2-year-old, like that would not be very kind because they don't understand. But if your kids are even, 5, 6, 7, obviously over 7, and you sit them down and you talk with them, like, here's the gift that I wasn't anticipating in my grief during those 7 days, is that a child's comfort is one of the most incredible gifts in the midst of grief. So my daughter, she was 7 at the time. She saw me crying and she came over, and she's my empathetic child, and she held this little angel thing that the hospice had given us, and she was just looking at it, and she started to cry. She has zero remembrance of my mother at all, okay, because she was so little. And she sat in my lap, and she just held me, and we cried together. And it was healthy, like it was a good crying. And when we were done, we both like wiped our tears, we gave each other a hug, and we just went on. And it was so good and beautiful and comforting. When shame comes calling, when it comes to grief, say no, like this is valid and this is true, and I'm not gonna listen to that. And I'm going to grieve, and it's okay, and it's not shameful, and I can bring my children into it. Caveat: do not expect anything of your kids. Don't make them feel guilty if they don't cry or they don't grieve in a way that you like. This is another way shame gets in. Say our child doesn't respond the way we think they should. Let's say their grandparent dies, or a pet dies, or they lose their best friend, or something happens, and they don't cry or they don't respond in a way that you think they should. Don't go being like, what's wrong with you? Like, why aren't you crying? Like, you should feel sad. Don't do that. That's another way of putting shame on our kids. They have to figure out their process of grief. You just allow them to see the truth of it. That's what you can do. Freedom is the key. This is the Get Free show, right? So freedom is the key. There's no proper way to grieve, and everybody does it differently. I think a big part of grief is that it's just really weird, and I think we just need to roll with that and not overthink it. So on the 1-year anniversary, and I think laughing in grief is just so healthy and good. We need laughter and humor. So on the 1-year anniversary of my mom's death, it just like hit me, like just this wave of grief. And I go to the grocery store. I'm crying in the grocery store. And I'm like, I need a plant. I need a plant. I don't know why, guys. I kill plants. Like, I am a plant killer. I don't know why I wanted a plant on the 1-year anniversary of my mom's death. And I see this plant and I grab this plant and I'm like, I have to have it. I have to have the plant. So I buy the plant. I bring the plant home and I name the plant Susie Hope. My mom's name was Susan. I named the plant Susie. This is not rational. This is not logical. This is the weirdness of grief, that I name a plant after my dead mother. And I show the kids and I'm like, this is Susie Hope. I don't know why I added hope to it. And I was like, we can never let this plant die because I just named it after my dead mother. Oh my gosh. It's been 3 years, guys. My plant is still alive. Praise the Lord. It's a miracle. And we all joke around that we can never let Susie die, the plant. So if it hits and you want to do a really weird thing, I mean, just roll with it. Just do it. Because it made no sense, no logical sense at all. It's kind of morbid and super weird. But like now we look at that plant and we laugh about it and we have this memory and we think about my mom and it turned into this really neat kind of thing. So if something comes up in your grief that makes zero sense to anybody else, but for whatever reason, you want to just do it. Just do it. Really quickly, I'll go through just a couple of specific things that may help you with grief. When you face a loss, any type of loss, you have to acknowledge it specifically. This thing happened and it hurts and I need to grieve it, and I'm not going to rush the grief. I'm going to allow the grief to surface and do what it needs to do instead of pushing it away. Shame, you have no right here. Figure out what works for you. So what works for you is not necessarily going to work for me. Some people, when they experience a loss or some kind of a grief, they paint. Some people write. I write my grief. That's what I do. Some people want to walk. They just want to go on walks every day in the quiet and process it that way. Some people want to process and talk about it with somebody. I've heard of people who have gone to a beach and with each seashell they threw into the ocean, they were like, I release this or I release that. It's so personal and it's so intimate. And you can ask the Lord, Lord, what was the first time I felt shame and loss or shame and grief? And go back to that. And then when you figure out what that is, say, rewrite a new story for that. So for example, I could go back to that little 8-year-old girl, me, when my grandfather died, and I could reframe that now and I can say, Sarah, there was nothing wrong with you grieving. You sweet little 8-year-old little girl, there was nothing wrong with it. You cry your heart out. You do not have to be ashamed. You did nothing wrong. It was a proper response to pain, to cry out and to grieve. And so we can go back and we can reframe things in our mind. So figure out, if you can, that first memory of where you first felt shame and loss, because I'll guarantee almost all of us, we've all had losses. And because shame is a part of our world, we have all experienced shame. If you want to delve more into this topic, I did interview my counselor, my college counselor, when I first mourned the loss of a mother. Her name is Melanie Harding, and I interviewed her on my podcast, episode number 3, which is Healing and Wisdom Through the Grieving Process. And thanks so much for tuning into the Get Free Show. All right, guys, if you have questions for me or there's a topic you want me to talk about, you can email me at sarah@sarahmay.com. Bye, guys.